The word conservation presumes in the modern world as little intervention with the object as possible. So I assume the field no longer artificially whitens the documents as they used to. So you mostly prevent further deterioration. You don't make the object look artificially better.
I think this is always the question that I think creates such like turmoil amongst conservators, particularly of paper, because I think it's such an ephemeral at times material. It's super durable sometimes, and sometimes it's incredibly fragile. And so we're very much, constantly talking with all stakeholders, be them like private clients or institutions that we've worked with who, they have expectations of things looking amazing. And I'm sure you find this with books as well, where it's like, I thought it was going to look like a brand new book. And you're like, nope, it's still an old book. So it's constantly this issue. But the trend in our field, the ethics, the trend in our ethics is really to do as minimal intervention as possible. With that in mind, there is, of course, the fact that whoever owns it does have a say in the treatment. So there is definitely a defining line where we say, this is how much conservation will do. And if they want us to go further, we're like, well, you're going to have to accept that that's now restoration if you are so adamant. But here are the reasons why we don't think you should do that. And if they still want to do that, then, we're kind of hard pressed to tell the owner of the object that they're not allowed to do something. So there's a lot of like steps in how that goes. But
that should be hard, telling the owner that he cannot do something with their object.
Yeah.
That's the issues with private conservation at times, that when you're dealing with someone that owns something and they come to you, they often want it to look perfect.
And I wouldn't say just private. I mean, there's definitely been cases that we've come across. I know I've definitely come across with institutions who there are people within the institutions who don't understand the limits of how far we should go. But in those instances, we definitely can say no. It feels better to say no to them because you're like, you should know better.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
And the ethics in your field has been developing rather rapidly, because only, say, 20 years ago, museums would go to such lengths at presenting their objects as beautiful as possible that they crossed many lines that we have today.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was like, it's been developing a lot late. I mean, the past 10, 20 years, yeah. And I think the worst time, I don't want to say this, I shouldn't say this. No, I was thinking about the 80s when conservation first started like happening. And there's so many questionable things that happened. However, we can't judge them that harshly because it was a different time. There were not all the research and all the science and all the chemistry behind what we do hadn't developed as much, and they didn't know as much. So now when we look back at decisions made like 30 years ago or more, there's a bit of a cringing moment, but we can but things have changed and have developed so much. So, and we're also like, I think the way that we work at the moment has to reflect the fact that people 20 years from now might still be cringing at what we are doing right now. So we have to consider like the reversibility of what we do, and the retaining original parts of the object without cleaning too much, because there's like one of the most important things right now is that why do you remove the dust? Why are you dusting things? Why are you removing this? Because dust contains so much information about the object. So you're basically altering the object itself, whether it be paper or whatever. I mean, this is throughout conservation. So there's a lot of new things that we have to think about, and also considering materiality of the object itself or the paper that you're using. It's just growing and growing more and more. So we just. Yeah, I don't know.
And that's,
but yeah.
No, but that's even just that's from an archival point of view, I think the other thing that we have to worry about a lot of times is within paper conservation, there's so many different forms of paper artwork. And that's where, when you were saying the dust, there's a lot of instances where artwork of all materials collects dust, but it has to, especially with modern works, it has to do with that's what the artist wanted. And then it's like, okay, well, okay, how do we manage that, and how do we manage the expectations of the museum versus or the person who owns it versus what the artist wanted, and in the aging process. I mean, there's so many cases like this that we're constantly kind of scratching our heads at and looking at in a way precedents of what's happened before. Yeah. So.
And I guess oxidation also may be a factor that the creator of an art object was, counting on to change the object over time. So if some conservator decides to remove oxidation from the object, it just ruins the idea of the creator or something like that.
I recently actually talked to a conservator who, like an older conservator, who mentioned that there was a drawing that they had cleaned, which was like a early 19th century drawing, which had a huge fleck of iron in the paper, and it was causing this horrible oxidation. The person, the I think museum involved, was like, get it out. And so they did. And now, like that person was saying, they look back on that like a cringe moment of like, oh, oops. They look at it like a cringe moment of like, oh God, like, why did I do that? I shouldn't have done that. But at the time, it's what was done. So yeah, we can't really look back and judge. And we hope that people don't look back at us and judge.
They will, but
Yeah, no, I know.
Absolutely will.
We're the judgiest.
Angelina, you mentioned that there's lots of information potentially available from analyzing dust. Could you perhaps give some examples? Because I only know of examples from parchment conservation, when they use special sticky tape and then just to clean it. And then they analyze it for DNA and stuff. I don't know the details, but I know that they can determine lots of things about the history of the use of the book, where it was made, where it traveled, who used it, how often.
Yeah, that's the biocriticology thing, research. There's nothing that comes particularly in mind. I think I've just been reading a lot, and it's always mentioned about just the fact that we remove the dust might contain so much information about it. And also it's just part of the object, not necessarily about the information that it contains. It's part of the object itself, because it has collected it, and it environmental things. And I think you learn a lot about, oh goodness me, I think is a lot about the environment and understanding that how the environment of the time was and what was happening at the time. But at the moment, I can't remember exactly what it is. So yeah, don't quote me on that.
I remember another example where just the distribution of dust between the pages can tell you about the pattern of use, which parts of the books were most read, which is also an interesting source and also part of the history of the object.
For an example that I know of is, in when they used to use like Arangol ink and ink in general to write, there was this powder or sand material that was used to dry the ink. So, you would open a letter and this would drop out. However, like throwing that away is basically a crime. It is part of the history of the object itself, like that, the powder that was used. I don't remember the name, but that is also one thing that just comes in mind, because, when I opened a letter once and I saw that, I didn't know what it was. I threw it away. I thought it was nothing, but considering from the things that I've learned so far, that happened like quite a few years ago. Now I'm just thinking like, oh my God, why did I do that? Like, I can't do these things. Like I hadn't considered what this meant, because in my mind I could not understand what it was used for, because I hadn't seen this before. But just thinking back, I'm just astonished by the fact that I did not think about that and just disposed of it. But that contains information.
That's a huge thing that I think our entire lives are spent putting lots of things in little baggies to make sure that we can preserve them to study them later, because we may not study them immediately, but they are super important. I mean, I'm just thinking back to the sheer amount of mold, which has been like the theme of this year for us. And, and also quite a number of books at institutions I've worked at before where they figured out the entire history of the book from the dust that's in between the guards. And it's from the foresight of those conservators who, again, like they had that experience of throwing it out before and then being like, oh, that would have had information. And then now being like, save it. So vital. So yeah, it's always little Ziploc bags filled with dust.
Yeah.
And in doing that, are you following your own practice, or is there an agreed upon set of protocols in individual organization or in the field in general? Say archives, I presume, or libraries are interested in keeping.
Yes, I think it depends on the sheer amount of, it depends on the capacity of each institution to continue that research, because there are lots of institutions that the content is more important than the object itself, I think, is one big thing to think about. And then also there's the concept of institutions that don't have access to that detailed of scientific research capabilities. Sorry?
Or even the equipment.
Yeah, and the equipment and things like this. So it's, I mean, there is a lot that has to go into that. But if you do, generally, that's what we would learn in school. That's probably what's considered best practice. And then once a treatment is complete, or once an assessment is complete, and you have all these little bags, if you then ask whoever the stakeholder is to say, do you have this ability to research this further? Would you like to? I mean, there could be some really interesting stuff that you find out. And yeah, I don't know. It's like I'd say it's 50-50. I'm not always on the research side. I am the one handing the bags to the scientists to put in their machines to do this incredible kind of assessment. But yeah, it really just depends on a case-by-case basis. And it is best practice to save things, that's for sure. Best practice to save and then ask later than, be posed with, hey, did you save all that dust? And you're like, oh no. True.
I definitely have this feeling that in the past few years, some attitudes have changed. And this is something that we discussed with one of our previous guests, Brenda Gallagher. She's a bookbinder and book artist, but she also knows some things about book restoration, book conservation. And we talked that modern approach is to understand that some 20, 50, 100 years from now, another conservator may work with your object, and you have to preserve as much for this future conservator. Not only the object itself, but as much of additional things and information and stuff attached to this object, so to make their work easier.
Yeah, documentation is key. Really key. Yeah, I really can't. I don't think we can stress it enough. Take all the notes you possibly can when treating things, because it will help somebody in the future. It'll help your client currently. It'll help the institution with things and research in the future. I mean, the sheer amount of information that we can get from a single object that has a lot of real world, modern, present day implications is huge as well. I think, especially in private conservation, there's a lot of dismissive kind of behavior around documentation, not from the conservator side, but from whoever is receiving that documentation. I mean, I have a lot of clients who I can definitely say are just like, do I really need this 8-page report with all of these pictures? And I'm like, you need it. Keep it, file it somewhere important. it's good for insurance purposes. It's good for further research in the future. It's good for provenance. It's good for, I mean, there's so many different reasons why it's important to keep that documentation and to have that kind of like, somebody in the future is going to look at this mentality. Like it's vital. Like so vital. If there's one thing you take away from this, like keep all your reports.